Today, we are going to talk about why your absurdism is not enough. So, when I'm with clients, and let's say it's a Christian client, the next move that they usually make in their deconstruction is some form of like liberal Christianity or UU or process theology. But with nihilists, the first stop in their journey after kind of like hitting the void where there's a lack of inherent meaning is absurdism. But what I'm going to be arguing today is that there's an emotional reason why we are drawn to absurdism and that it really isn't a full balanced breakfast when it comes to a full kind of philosophical system that tends towards human thriving. As always, my name is Brit Hartley. I'm an atheist spiritual director here at No Nonsense Spirituality, and the majority of what I do for a living is nihilism coaching, which is a strange but very meaningful little niche that I found myself in. So let's start with just like a very brief what is absurdism. So absurdism is a philosophy that came out of the 20th century, mainly championed by a guy named Albert Camus. And Camus looked at human existence and basically said, okay, we really, really want life to have meaning, but the universe doesn't give us one. And that tension, that paradox, the fact that we crave meaning in a meaningless world is what he called the absurd. Now, instead of trying to fix this problem like religion does by giving life a divine purpose, or even like existentialism does by saying like, it's your responsibility to create your own meaning, Camus just says, no, like the whole point is that there is no fix. We just have to embrace that this is an absurd situation and just live anyways, is basically his response to it. So what do we do with this absurd situation? Camus outlines three possible responses. One is physical suicide. This would be the most extreme reaction. If life has no meaning, some people conclude that there's no reason to then keep living. And Camus rejected this outright, calling it like a failure to engage with life as it is. And then there's philosophical suicide, which I do see quite a bit when people hit nihilism, which is that people will create or adopt a system that solves the problem, like a religious faith or an ideological dogma. And Camus saw this as an escape. It's a way to avoid the truth rather than face it. I see this in people who will kind of like take a glimpse into the abyss and then just like instantly cling to some kind of God in order to comfort themselves and find some reason to live rather than facing what appears to be that we're in a universe that doesn't have inherent meaning. So the third response that Camus advocates for is revolt, to fully embrace life while accepting that it has no inherent meaning. So instead of checking out either philosophically or physically, you lean into experience and joy and struggle and creativity, knowing full well that this is all absurd. So there's this, at its core, there's this rebelliousness to absurdism. And a lot of people who are really attracted to absurdism have rebelliousness as part of their nature. So where nihilism says there is no meaning, and existentialism says it's your responsibility to create meaning, absurdism says we live in an absurd, meaningless world, but live anyway, like out of pure spite almost. And so he uses as his analogy Sisyphus, the guy from Greek mythology who has to roll a boulder up a hill. I think I have him behind me somewhere. It's kind of dark, but you can see him right here. I have him behind me. Camus saw this story, Sisyphus, as the perfect metaphor for life, that we keep pushing the rock up, it keeps rolling back down, and yet we keep going. So according to Camus, the key is to accept this absurd and find joy in the struggle itself. And so he ends his book, The Myth of Sisyphus, by saying we must imagine Sisyphus happy. So absurdism is not about trying to solve the problem of meaninglessness, but just living in the face of this problem, like accepting that this problem exists. So it's kind of poetic. So before we get into its flaws, I want to compare absurdism just really briefly to two ideas that it often gets confused with, which is nihilism and optimistic nihilism. So nihilism in its purest form says nothing matters, so why bother? It often leads to despair or apathy or hedonism, where you just chase pleasure because nothing has really any deep significance. Optimistic nihilism says nothing matters, and that's great news. I mean, many people people who just go right through nihilism into optimistic nihilism, especially if freedom is a really high core value, because it's freeing just to say, now I get to decide what matters to me, and life is this blank canvas, and I can just enjoy this ride without stressing that it's some ultimate purpose. So if you enjoy life and freedom is a high core value for you, sometimes you really can just move right into optimistic nihilism and really are thriving. That wasn't me. I had to learn how to do that because I'm much more neurotic and much more of a pessimistic nihilist by nature, especially when I was going through the worst of my nihilism. But for some people with that personality type, it's very easy to just be an optimistic nihilist and just see life as just this blank canvas that they get to play on. Absurdism is different from both. It doesn't say that we should create meaning like optimistic nihilism, but it doesn't really say that we should give up, like straight up pure nihilism. Instead, it says the universe will never give us meaning, but we should live fully anyway. It's about embracing the absurdity rather than trying to fight it or trying to solve it. But here's the thing, absurdism alone is not a full philosophy for a thriving life. It is a starting point. But if you stay in absurdism, without adding more to it, you're going to run into some serious roadblocks. Mostly what I think absurdism is doing for people, including myself, I'm not floating above this. This is I'm including myself in this too, is that people who come across the abyss of nihilism, it's giving them emotional validation from a philosopher who says, yeah, this is an insane situation we find ourselves in. We're here on this planet. We're flying through space in these meat suits with electricity in our brains. We have no idea how life started on this planet. We don't know how our story ends. We don't know how we will die. We don't know what happens after we die. And some people seem really happy and some people really aren't. And I'm not sure how I'm supposed to go about that in my own life. And our brains are these meaning-making, pattern-making machines, but we're in a universe that doesn't have any meaning, which is kind of absurd. And then evolution doesn't care about whether you're happy or not. It just cares that you continue on, and that your genes continue on. And then we live and we reproduce and we die, and in 3 generations we're forgotten, and the gods we worship, who we think will save us, also eventually die. And we don't know when we're going to die. And sometimes it's the most silly way, you just bonk your head too hard. And we're in these bodies that want meaning and in this universe that couldn't give a shit. So emotionally, I feel like when you're in that and you're realizing that and the matrix has blown open for you, emotionally, absurdism is that friend who says, yeah, I know, this is crazy. And you're right? And that's what absurdism is doing for us. It doesn't tell you how to live. It just emotionally validates you that this is a very strange predicament that we find ourselves in. And if we could have created a world or created a universe, we would have made it differently than this. We wouldn't have made it like this. And so I just feel like absurdism is that friend when you hit nihilism that just says I know that this is insane. I know that this is crazy. I know that everybody else has a story for how this is okay or a plan. But when you lose that, it's just that friend who says yeah, this is really, really strange, this situation we find ourselves in. And it's just so emotionally validating to hear that. It's also emotionally validating for people that absurdism takes seriously the question of suicide and doesn't make you feel like you're crazy. This is the first question of philosophy, according to Camus, that we suffer and there's no meaning in the universe. And so suicide is not just something that people who are very depressed or mentally ill in some way will consider. It's a serious question. And that can be really validating to hear, even though he's not going to encourage that. It can just be validating to hear if you're someone who has thoughts of suicidal ideation from a philosophical standpoint, that that you're not crazy for considering the math of all of this. I get this the most in my clients, honestly, from people who are on the autism spectrum. People on the autism spectrum tend to be, if they're in religion, they tend to be very fundamentalist, or if they're not in religion, they tend to be more atheistic and nihilistic. And sometimes when there's suicidal ideation with that, they're just doing the math of whether it's worth it or not to be alive without doing the mental, emotional gymnastics that neurotypical people will do. And then they find out like the math ain't mathin'. And this is different than just depression. And so that can be, even though Camus will not encourage this path, nor do I, it can be emotionally validating to just hear someone take that question seriously and not make you feel like you're crazy. And so for those reasons, I think it can just be like this friend, especially in the beginning of your nihilism journey. So here are, for me, I think there's 10 reasons, I can't remember, 10 reasons why I think absurdism falls short. Now, the main one for me, the first one for me is that it is a terrible way to raise children. So Albert Camus did have children. He had twins, Catherine and John, born in 1945. And Catherine has been really involved in preserving and managing her father's legacy. And Camus wrote extensively about the human condition and absurdity and the struggle for meaning, but he never addressed it from a parenting lens, probably because he just really was not a very present father. He was a distracted philosopher, lost in his work and his writings and traveling. He was also a bit of a womanizer. And so when I'm in nihilism and I'm a woman and I have young children and I don't have a maid and I don't have his life where I can just like write and travel the world, like absurdism is not enough for me. Like my kids are asking me questions, and absurdism, like, oh, just embrace the absurd, is not only not helpful for them, it's actually psychologically damaging for them, because kids are going to need a lot more than that. And so Camus just was really never really helpful for me, except for that emotional validation of just validating that we're in this absurd situation. So absurdism is a philosophy for adults who are grappling with the meaninglessness of life, but when it comes to raising kids, it all starts to fall apart. So like, think about it. If absurdism is all about staring into the void, recognizing that life has no inherent meaning and deciding to live anyway, that's fine. But like, you've already gone through some existential battles. You probably know who you are. Maybe you have a career by then, but kids aren't existentialists. They're meaning seekers. They ask big and relentless questions like, why are we here and what happens when we die and what's the point of everything? And if all you have to say is just like, life is absurd, kid, just like roll with it, that's not just unhelpful, it's potentially psychologically damaging for children. Children need a nest period. They need a foundation. They need stories. They need narratives. They need moral structures to help them understand the world and their place in it. That's why even the most secular parents still lean on things like moral values and traditions and storytelling and rituals. It's because it's really good for children. And you don't have to be religious to teach a kid about like kindness and perseverance or fairness, but you do need to offer them something more than just defiance in the face of the absurd. Like a 5-year-old trying to process the death of his dog, or a 10-year-old trying to understand what's fair, or a teenager struggling with their self-worth. None of that is going to be comforted by the idea that life is meaningless, but we should just keep going anyway. They need something to work with. They need something to build on. Even if they nuance that later on in life, they do need that nest period, which is why even secular worldviews like humanism or existentialism steps in where absurdism falls short. So humanism will do better in offering a sense of purpose that, maybe life has no grand meaning, but we can create meaning by helping others. Existentialism would say, life is absurd, but we have the responsibility to shape our own values, and the world needs us to do this. Stoicism is going to give like practical tools for resilience. It's also going to give you core values. All of these provide something that absurdism alone doesn't, which is a framework and tools for navigating life rather than just like an attitude towards life. And then there's just like the issue of legacy. Parenting isn't just about raising a kid to survive. It's about passing down tools and wisdom and values and a way of making sense of the world. And so if absurdism is purely about how an individual copes with meaninglessness, then what exactly are you handing off to your child when they ask, what should I do with my life? Who am I? How do I find purpose? If your only answer is like, you decide, that's technically true, but it's not very helpful when kids are younger. Kids need guidance before they're ready to build their own meaning. They need a lot of scaffolding to get to absurdism, and absurdism, isn't going to give that to them. So at the end of the day, absurdism works best as an attitude, not a full foundation, because it's the attitude that helps adults deal with life's uncertainties, but children need something more structured before they can start to wrestle with the absurd and do so from a psychologically safe place. So if you're trying to raise kids with absurdism alone, you're going to have to bring in something else: psychology, humanism, existentialism, stoicism, something, Buddhism, even some forms of like secular religion, just to give them a solid enough footing to then one day be able to face the absurd on their own terms. Number two, it's more of a mood than a system. Absurdism is really just more of a vibe than a structured philosophy for a way of life. It gives you this defiant attitude of like, life doesn't make sense, but I'll live it anyway, which is kind of punk rock, but like, then what? Like, compare it to something like Stoicism, which has daily practices, cognitive tools, guiding principles, or Buddhism, which has a clear path with meditation and ethical living, and mindfulness and the Eightfold Path. Absurdism doesn't have any of that. It's more of just like a mental posture than a guide for living. So there's no mechanism within absurdism that pushes people towards growth or resilience or contribution. And from all that we know from the science of happiness that makes your life better, we do benefit more when we have those things. And so it's just leaving too much into personal interpretation without resources, which is why it often ends up just as like a cool existential aesthetic rather than actually a fully functioning philosophy for a way of life. Number three, it doesn't help in deep suffering. Absurdism can be great. I see the people I know who are absurdist and are thriving with it best are people whose lives are good. Like, they're out in nature, they're sipping coffee, they have a meaningful job, they have quite a bit of money, they have really good relationships, and they're just like dancing with how silly and fun life can be. But what about when real suffering hits? You just lost someone you love, you're dealing with serious illness, you're deep into grief, you travel to India and walk around streets where there's open defecation and things, that a level of poverty that you've never seen before. Does absurdism really give you any tools for being able to process or cope with some of these deep ways of suffering? And so other philosophies do help people cope with suffering. Like Buddhism will do a lot with attachment and impermanence and help you work with suffering. Stoicism will give you tools for resilience and how to reframe hardship. Mystical traditions will provide community and a sense of transcendence and inner peace. And even like political movements will at least help you to get involved and engage with reducing suffering. Absurdism doesn't really engage with suffering beyond saying like, life is absurd, just keep going. And that may work for someone. It especially works if your life is just good, just already good. But most people need something more substantial to get through life's hardest moments. So like, Sisyphus being happy has a lot to do with your privilege. Like, this Sisyphus may be happy just pushing this rock up the hill, but if you're like getting shot with arrows, it's not going to be enough. Like, it's just not going to be enough, and you're not going to be happy pushing your rock up the hill. And so if Sisyphus being happy has a lot to do with privilege, and you don't have privilege and your life is mostly suffering, and all you have is just like, well, life is absurd, that's not going to be a system that sustains you like in a concentration camp, whereas Viktor Frankl's logotherapy would be much more helpful in a system where there's a lot of suffering. So number four, it lacks a moral framework. Absurdism doesn't tell you how to treat other people. It's entirely possible to be an absurdist asshole. You could be an absurdist who takes on a deeply kind, ethical, you can become a kind, ethical person who values others, or you could be a self-absorbed jerk who exploits people because like nothing matters. Because absurdism doesn't have a moral structure, you're left to figure out ethics on your own. Camus himself leaned towards humanist values, but absurdism as a philosophy doesn't demand it or support it or tell you why you should lean towards humanist values. So if you compare that to other philosophies that explicitly define how to act, those can be more helpful. Like Kantian ethics says morality is based on universal principles, or Utilitarianism says morality is about maximizing human well-being, or humanism, which promotes kindness and progress. Absurdism doesn't really take a stance on what's right and wrong, which is a problem if you're looking for moral guidance, because the science shows that you can't have a happy life without some kind of moral system. We have no science that shows that you being an asshole actually leads to you being more happy. And so if you want help and some system to be able to deal with your natural assholery, absurdism is not going to help you with that. Assholery. It's a good word. Is that a word? I'm going to call it a word. Number 5, it doesn't address connection and community. Humans are by nature social creatures. We crave belonging, love, and deep relationships. We cannot be truly thriving when we look at markers of well-being without that. The problem is that absurdism is mostly focused on the individual. It's about your personal confrontation with meaninglessness. There's no sense of how to build meaning relationships, how to contribute to something bigger than yourself, how to find joy in community, or even that you need that. Meanwhile, religion, humanism, existentialism, any of these other isms are offering strong ideas about the importance of human connection. Absurdism by itself risks making people detached loners rather than engaged participants in life. Absurdism could never build community. It just doesn't have enough to it to be able to build something. And if we are social creatures, in order to be happy, absurdism can't help with that. It is individualistic by nature. Number 6, it struggles with ambition and purpose. So if life has no inherent meaning, it can take the wind out of your sails as far as deciding what's worth doing with your life. It just has no tools to help motivate you towards something, towards projects and aspects of growing yourself that are inherently meaningful. It has no tools for how to decide how to live, how to take risks into authenticity, how to find out who you are and what you want to do. So some absurdists do find that on their own, but many absurdists get stuck there because there's just no tools for that. And if a lot of happiness is just getting incrementally closer towards what you imagine your best life to be, and absurdism isn't a motivating philosophy, it can leave you really lacking if you're not someone who is a naturally motivated person. I am not a natural, I have friends that wake up and who are just natural goal setters. I am not one of those people. And so absurdism would be really lacking for me in that way. Absurdists, some of my clients who are absurdists will really struggle with long-term purpose, setting goals, is discipline even necessary if existence is just a joke, and then avoiding existential burnout. It's kind of easy to drift without a solid foundation. Number 7, it doesn't provide a view on death. So Camus avoided comforting illusions about death, and I do appreciate that from him. I appreciate anyone who's able to look death in the eye. He just kind of said, live in the face of that. And I do appreciate his existential courage. But for many people who do not have existential courage as a core value, or something natural that comes to them, it's not going to be enough for most people. We know that from our modern terror management studies, which is showing us how much our subconscious is compartmentalizing and avoiding thinking about death all the time. But in Buddhism, you're going to get a ton of tools for impermanence and death. In Stoicism, you'll get memento mori, and we're going to use death in order to help it to focus us on these values. And sometimes we need help to process the fact that we're going to die and learn how to be okay with it. I have people who come in and they're just, even if it's irrational, they just fantasize in this unhealthy way of just dying and floating in blackness forever. And they need tools to be able to find ways to emotionally process that, or other ways to think about it, or meditation tools. We just need tools for that, and absurdism can't give you anything for that. So Buddhism is going to teach acceptance and preparation for death. Stoicism is going to do memento mori. Religious traditions will still provide some tools for how to process death, even if it's just rituals, things like funerals or how we remember people. Absurdism just shrugs and says, yep, we die, oh well. And that may be enough for some people, but it may not be enough for many people. Number 8, it's not a solution for everyone. So absurdism tends to appeal to skeptical intellectual types, but not everyone is that type. And I do think it's sometimes naive to assume that this tool that was working for Camus is then going to work for everyone, because people have different kinds of core values. And so some people, and we find this from our studies of fundamentalists, we know that fundamentalists as a personality type are people who need structure and meaning and ritual and order in order to thrive psychologically. And without it, not only do they suffer more, but they're also more likely to either end their life or numb out their life, which helps no one. And so if absurdism can't reach them or help them or provide anything more grounded, then by nature, we have to call this an ism that can only help certain kinds of people. And we just have to be honest about that. All right, number 9, it doesn't address the reality of collective struggle. So absurdism, like I said before, is an individual confrontation with meaninglessness, and it doesn't engage with collective struggles. So that could be societal oppression, economic injustice, political resistance. Camus himself was involved in political discourse, particularly during the French Resistance and the Algerian War. But his philosophy as a whole doesn't provide a clear framework for collective action or encourage you toward it. Because if life has no inherent meaning, like why fight for a better world? And he never really fleshes out that idea. Like, why is he engaging in activism or working towards justice if everything is absurd? I think we can develop reasons for that. But absurdism on its own doesn't offer by itself a compelling reason beyond just personal rebellion. And so many people find purpose in causes that transcend their own experiences, and absurdism would leave space for that, but wouldn't encourage that or give you tools for that or tell you why you should be involved in things in order to be able to help you live a truly fulfilling, connected, and engaged life, which we do know tends towards happiness. And then last one, number 10, it doesn't offer any sense of transcendence or deep connection or mysticism or spirituality. So absurdism encourages embracing the meaninglessness nature of life, but it doesn't account for the deeply human need to experience awe or states of transcendence or deep emotional connection beyond the self. There are states of consciousness that we can experience where you feel like you're one with everything, or you feel like you can hold and love the whole world. Now, even if we don't tie magic or God to any of that, these are still states of consciousness that are worth experiencing. There are things that we can experience as humans that are good for us, even if we don't fully understand some of these things. So many people throughout history have sought moments that feel bigger than their own existence. This can be like love and nature and art and music and the Grand Canyon, or some sense of the sacred without necessarily being religious. Like even me as an atheist, I will go, if I'm in Europe, I will go, which I've only been to once. I don't know why I said it like I'm going there all the time. When I did go to Europe, I saw all the cathedrals because there was just a sense of the sacred that I could appreciate, even though I don't believe in any of the beliefs wrapped around it. So while Camus celebrates rebellion against meaninglessness, absurdism doesn't offer a structured way to cultivate these experiences that make life very rich and deeply fulfilling. When you experience awe, you become more grateful, you become more happy, you get out of your neuroticism, you're more likely to let grudges go. We have science to show all of this. And so if people turn to just pure absurdism, then there's going to be a lack of these spiritual experiences, even if we're not including God in this, which I don't. Those are still experiences worth having. So if I were someone who considered themselves an absurdist, if you're listening and you've called yourself an absurdist, here's what I would add to your breakfast to make it like a full breakfast here. I would add tools for suffering and death from Buddhism. Buddhism does that best. Impermanent suffering, death. Do all that with Buddhism. I would add secular humanism for parenting and for structure. I would add stoicism for falling in love with the journey of self-improvement. I would add inner work like core values, shadow work, inner child work, personality typing, just to figure out who you are and what you want so that you can make more intentional choices about how you want to live your life. I would add community, whether that's through a Sangha or a UU or a hiking group or a book club or a girls group, anything. Find your people. I would add existentialism for meaning and purpose and really honing in on what your meaning and purpose is, and that it's your responsibility, because as a world of people who suffer, we need you. And the world is a worse place if you don't add your core values and your voice to the table in a way that we need you. I would add some kind of collective movement you're a part of that is reducing suffering in some way. I would pour some time and resources into that. That may be political, that may be even in just my coaching and in just my social media, where I am part of a movement of people moving away from religion that's meaningful to me. And I would also add some form of spirituality, mysticism, access to a wisdom tradition, even psychedelics for things like inspiration and wisdom and states of transcendence and awe that we can all experience of humanism. So for all of that, follow me here for more no nonsense spirituality, where we do recognize the absurd. I think I have my little rock guy from Everything Everywhere All at Once. I really do embrace the absurd, but also we can take tools from religion and spirituality and the science of happiness in order to build a fully thriving life without faith, without bullshit, without believing in things that aren't true. But we can still get resources we need to withstand the harsh truths of reality and not look away. So let me know in the comments if I was right about absurdism, if you feel like it's more of an emotional validation than a fully fledged philosophy. And also, I haven't decided what I'm going to talk about next week, so I would love to hear what you guys would love to hear next, because I haven't quite decided where I want to go next week. So let me know, and I'm open to requests.